right now. As you sit here watching this, you believe your suffering is coming from life, from people, from problems, from things not going your way. You think the world is making you feel this way. But what if that's not true? What if your suffering is not coming from outside, but is being quietly created inside your own mind? Not intentionally, not consciously, but constantly, because the most dangerous kind of suffering is the one you don't realize you are creating. And until you see it clearly, it will follow you everywhere. No matter where you go, no matter what you achieve, no matter who you become. But over 2,500 years ago, Gautama Buddha uncovered something most people still don't understand. You are not trapped by life. You are trapped by how you relate to it. And once you see this, everything begins to change. The illusion of "it's not me." There is something your mind has been doing for so long that you no longer notice it. It happens instantly, effortlessly, silently, and because of that, it feels true. Every time something disturbs you, every time discomfort appears, every time life does not go the way you expected, your mind moves in one direction, outward. It searches for a reason outside of you, a person, a situation, a mistake, a moment that didn't unfold the way you wanted. And without even questioning it, you accept the conclusion. This is why I feel this way. It feels obvious. It feels undeniable. It feels like reality itself. But what you are experiencing is not reality. It is interpretation. And that interpretation is happening so quickly, so automatically, that you mistake it for truth. This is the first illusion. The illusion that your suffering is being caused by something outside of you. Because if that were true, then every person in the same situation would feel the same way. But they don't. Two people can stand in the same moment and live in completely different worlds. One feels anger, the other feels understanding. One feels anxiety, the other feels calm. One feels broken, the other feels acceptance. The situation is the same, but the experience is different. So where is the difference coming from? Not from life, but from the mind, from the meaning your mind creates. And this meaning is not neutral. It is shaped by your expectations, your past, your beliefs, your fears, your desires. It is shaped by everything you think life should be. And when reality does not match that image, your mind reacts. It tightens. It resists. It says, "This shouldn't be happening." And in that moment, suffering begins. Not because something went wrong, but because your mind decided it shouldn't be that way. This is so subtle that you almost never see it, because the mind does not present it as a choice. It presents it as fact. It tells you, this is bad, this is unfair, this is not right, and you believe it. You don't stop to question where that judgment came from. You don't ask whether it is absolutely true. You simply feel the emotion and assume the world caused it. But what is actually happening is that the world is triggering a reaction, and your mind is completing the story. And that story is where your suffering lives. You are not just experiencing what happens, you are experiencing what you think about what happens. And that layer of thinking is invisible to you most of the time, because it feels like you. It feels like your voice. It feels like your perspective. But it is a conditioned process, a learned pattern, something that has been repeating for so long that it feels natural. But natural does not mean true. It only means familiar. And this familiarity is what keeps the illusion alive. Because you don't question what feels normal. You don't examine what seems obvious. You simply continue reacting again and again in the same way. You expect things to go a certain way. You expect people to behave a certain way. You expect life to follow a certain path. And when it doesn't, your mind creates resistance. Not a loud resistance, not something dramatic, but a quiet inner tension, a tightening in your thoughts, a heaviness in your chest, a subtle discomfort that lingers beneath the surface. And that discomfort is what you call suffering. But look closely. Is it coming from what happened, or from the gap between what happened and what you wanted to happen? That gap is everything, because the larger the gap, the stronger the resistance. And the stronger the resistance, the deeper the suffering. So what you are really experiencing is not just life. It is life filtered through expectation, through the idea that things should be different, that this moment should be better, that reality should align with your mind. And when it doesn't, you feel disturbed. But what if reality is not the problem? What if this moment is exactly as it is supposed to be? Not in a philosophical sense, but in a simple, undeniable way. Because it is already happening, it is already real, and resisting it does not change it. It only creates conflict within you. This is where the shift begins. Not by changing what happens, but by seeing how your mind reacts to it. By noticing the instant your mind says, "This shouldn't be happening." By recognizing the moment you create a story around what is, because once you see it, even briefly, something begins to loosen. You are no longer completely inside the reaction. You are observing it, and in that observation, there is space. A small space, but powerful. A space where you are not immediately pulled into suffering. A space where you can see that the discomfort is not coming from life itself, but from your resistance to it. And this changes everything, because for the first time, you begin to realize something that most people never fully understand. Your suffering is not being done to you. It is being created through the way your mind meets reality. Not consciously, not intentionally, but consistently. And the moment you begin to see this pattern, you are no longer completely trapped inside it. You are beginning to wake up, not from life, but from the illusion of how you have been experiencing it. And this is the first step, not toward happiness, not toward fixing anything, but toward clarity. Because without seeing this, you will spend your entire life trying to change the outside, while the real source of your suffering remains untouched, hidden, repeating, unquestioned. But now you are starting to see, and once you truly see, you can never go back to being completely unaware again. The invisible mechanism of your suffering. Now that you begin to see that your suffering is not simply coming from the outside, something even more subtle starts to reveal itself. Because it is not just that the mind reacts, it is how it reacts that creates the depth of your suffering. There is a hidden mechanism running beneath every experience you have. A pattern so deeply ingrained that it operates before you even notice it. And this mechanism has three movements: craving, aversion, control. These are not ideas. They are lived processes. They are happening inside you all the time, every moment, every thought, every reaction. When something feels pleasant, the mind moves toward it. It says, "I want this. I need more of this. This should stay." This is craving. When something feels uncomfortable, the mind moves away from it. It says, "I don't want this. This shouldn't be happening. This needs to stop." This is aversion. And between these two movements, there is a third force. The desire to control, to arrange life in a way where only what you like remains, and everything you dislike disappears. And this entire process feels completely natural. It feels like the only way to live, because you have never questioned it. But this is the engine of your suffering. Not because craving is wrong, not because aversion is bad, but because both are based on a misunderstanding of reality, because reality does not obey your preferences. Pleasure comes and goes. Pain comes and goes. Situations arise and pass. People enter and leave. Everything moves. Everything changes. Everything flows. But your mind does not accept this. It tries to freeze what feels good and eliminate what feels bad. And this effort creates tension, constant tension, because you are trying to control something that cannot be controlled. And the more you try, the more resistance you create. Look closely at your own experience. When something good happens, do you simply experience it? Or do you immediately think about how to keep it, how to repeat it, how to make sure it doesn't disappear? And in that moment, the peace of the experience is already disturbed, because now you are no longer just living it. You are managing it, protecting it, holding on to it. And that holding is the beginning of fear. Fear of losing, fear of change, fear of the unknown. So even in pleasure, there is unease. Now look at the other side. When something uncomfortable happens, do you simply allow it? Or does the mind immediately resist it? Does it say, "This is wrong, this shouldn't be happening, I need to fix this"? And in that resistance, the discomfort intensifies, not because the situation itself becomes worse, but because you are fighting against it. You are adding a second layer, not just pain, but rejection of pain, not just discomfort, but resistance to discomfort. And this second layer is what transforms simple pain into suffering. This is why two people can face the same difficulty and experience completely different levels of suffering, because one resists and the other allows. One fights reality and the other flows with it. And the difference between those two experiences is not the situation, it is the relationship to the situation. This is what Gautama Buddha saw with absolute clarity, that life itself is not the problem. The mind's reaction to life is. And until you see this mechanism, you will continue to strengthen it. Every time you chase pleasure, every time you resist discomfort, every time you try to control the uncontrollable, you reinforce the pattern. You make it stronger, faster, more automatic. So much so that it begins to define your entire experience of life. You no longer respond to what is happening. You react based on what you want to happen. And this creates a constant inner conflict, because reality is one thing and your expectations are another, and the gap between them is where suffering lives. But here is where it becomes even more subtle. Because this mechanism is not just operating in big moments, it is operating in the smallest details of your life. In conversation, in thoughts, in tiny emotional shifts. You expect someone to reply in a certain way. They don't, and you feel disturbed. You expect your day to go smoothly. It doesn't, and you feel frustrated. You expect your mind to be calm. It isn't, and you feel restless. And each of these moments seems insignificant, but together they form a continuous state of unease, a low-level suffering that never fully disappears, because the mind is always wanting something different, always moving towards something else, always rejecting what is here. And this is why you feel tired, not because life is too heavy, but because you are constantly resisting it, constantly trying to adjust it, constantly trying to make it fit your preferences. And this effort never ends, because the moment one desire is fulfilled, another appears. The moment one problem is solved, another arises. The mind does not stop. It cannot stop, because it is built to seek, built to compare, built to become. And as long as you are identified with this movement, you will be pulled by it, again and again, without rest, without peace. But something begins to change. The moment you see this clearly, not intellectually, not as an idea, but as a direct observation, you begin to notice the craving as it arises. You begin to notice the resistance as it forms. You begin to notice the urge to control. And in that noticing, something subtle happens. You are no longer completely inside the pattern. You are watching it. And that changes everything. Because what you can observe, you are no longer fully trapped in. The pattern may still appear, but it begins to lose its power. Because you are no longer feeding it blindly. You are no longer reinforcing it without awareness. And slowly, very slowly, the grip begins to loosen. Not because you forced it, but because you understood it. And this is the beginning of real freedom. Not controlling the mind, but seeing it. Not stopping thoughts, but understanding them. Not escaping life, but changing your relationship to it. Because the moment you stop fighting reality, you stop creating unnecessary suffering. And in that space, even if life remains imperfect, something inside you becomes lighter, more open, more at ease. Not because everything is resolved, but because you are no longer adding resistance to what is. And that is where the door begins to open, not to happiness, but to something deeper, something quieter, something that does not depend on life being perfect, something that begins to emerge. The moment you stop trying to control everything, and that is what we move into next. The deepest layer, the self that creates suffering. Now, if you continue to observe carefully, if you don't stop at the surface of reactions, if you don't settle for simply noticing craving and resistance, you begin to see something far more unsettling, something that sits beneath everything. Because craving does not happen on its own. Resistance does not happen on its own. The need to control does not appear randomly. They all have a center, a silent center, a presence that feels like you. The one who wants, the one who resists, the one who feels disturbed, the one who is trying to fix everything. And this center, this sense of me, feels so real, so solid, so unquestionable, that you never think to examine it. You assume it is you, your identity, your personality, your truth. But what if this self is not what you think it is? What if the very thing you are protecting, improving, defending, is actually part of the illusion that creates your suffering? This is where the understanding becomes deeper, because now you are no longer just looking at your thoughts. You are looking at the one who believes those thoughts. Look closely. When a thought appears, I don't like this, who is speaking? When discomfort arises, this shouldn't be happening, who is reacting? When desire forms, I need this to feel better, who is wanting? It feels like there is a clear answer. It feels like you are there, a stable observer, a fixed identity, a continuous self. But if you look more carefully, this self is not stable. It is constantly changing. In one moment, you feel confident. In another, you feel insecure. In one moment, you feel calm. In another, you feel anxious. So which one is the real you? The confident one? The insecure one? The calm one? The anxious one? Or are all of them temporary states? If they are all changing, then what exactly are you holding on to? This is where the illusion begins to crack, because the self you are defending is not a fixed entity. It is a collection of thoughts, memories, reactions, and identities, coming together moment by moment. And yet, you treat it as something solid, something permanent, something that must be protected. And this protection is where suffering becomes deeply rooted. Because now, every experience is personal. Every situation becomes about you. If something goes wrong, you feel attacked. If someone disagrees, you feel threatened. If something changes, you feel unstable. Not because these things are inherently harmful, but because they challenge the image you hold of yourself. And that image must be maintained, must be defended, must be reinforced. So the mind is constantly working, comparing, judging, protecting, trying to keep this self intact. But this effort is endless, because the self is not fixed. It is fluid. It is always shifting, and trying to stabilize something that is constantly changing creates tension, deep tension. You are trying to become a permanent version of something that cannot stay the same. You are trying to define yourself in a world that is always moving, and that conflict is the root of your deeper suffering. This is why even when everything seems fine, there is still unease. Because the self is never fully secure. It is always looking for validation, always looking for confirmation, always asking, am I okay? Am I enough? Am I safe? And until it feels certain, it cannot rest. But certainty never arrives, because life keeps changing. People keep changing. You keep changing. So the self keeps searching, trying to find something stable, something solid, something that will finally make it feel complete. And this search never ends, because the self itself is the thing that is unstable. This is what Gautama Buddha pointed toward with extraordinary clarity, that the idea of a fixed, separate self is an illusion. Not in the sense that you don't exist, but in the sense that what you think you are is not solid, not permanent, not something that can be fully defined. And once you begin to see this, not as an idea, but as a direct observation, something begins to shift. The need to protect yourself softens. The need to defend your identity weakens. The need to constantly prove something fades. Because you begin to understand there is nothing fixed to protect, nothing permanent to hold on to, nothing solid to defend. And in that realization, a different kind of space opens. A space where experiences are no longer taken personally, where thoughts are seen as passing events, not absolute truths, where emotions are allowed to rise and fall, without defining who you are. And in that space, suffering begins to dissolve, not because life becomes perfect, but because the one who was struggling against life is no longer as rigid, no longer as fixed, no longer as reactive. And this does not mean you disappear. It means you become lighter, more flexible, more open, less attached to being a certain way, less dependent on everything going a certain way. And as that attachment weakens, so does suffering, because now there is less to protect, less to defend, less to lose. And when there is less to lose, there is less fear. And where there is less fear, there is more freedom. Not a dramatic freedom, not something loud or overwhelming, but a quiet, steady, unshakable ease. A sense that you are no longer fighting life, but moving with it. And this is the beginning of something profound, because when the illusion of a fixed self begins to fade, the entire structure of your suffering begins to collapse. Not instantly, not completely, but gradually, naturally, as if something heavy that you have been carrying your whole life is finally being set down. And for the first time, you realize you were never meant to carry it at all. The moment you stop resisting, now, as the illusion of control begins to weaken, as the sense of a fixed self starts to soften, as you see more clearly how your mind has been creating suffering, you come face to face with something the mind has been avoiding all along. Not because it is complicated, but because it removes the very thing the mind depends on: control. Because if there is no solid self to protect, if thoughts are not absolute truth, if emotions are not permanent, then what is left for the mind to hold on to? Nothing. And this is where fear appears. Not loud, not obvious, but deep. A quiet discomfort with letting things be. Because, for so long, your entire way of living has been based on managing life, trying to shape it, trying to improve it, trying to avoid what you don't like and secure what you do. And now, you are being invited into something completely different. Not control, but allowing. Not fixing, but seeing. Not changing everything, but understanding what is already happening. And to the mind, this feels dangerous because it believes that if you stop controlling, everything will fall apart. If you stop resisting, you will become weak. If you stop trying, you will lose everything. But look carefully. Has control ever truly worked? Have you ever reached a point where everything stayed exactly how you wanted it? Where nothing changed, nothing was lost, nothing disturbed your peace? No, because life does not work that way. It moves, constantly, unpredictably, beyond your control. So the real question is not, how do I control life better? But, what happens when I stop trying to control it at all? This is the turning point, because when you stop resisting, something unexpected begins to happen. The tension that you have been carrying starts to dissolve, not because life becomes perfect, but because you are no longer fighting it. Think about it. Every moment of suffering you have experienced has had one thing in common: resistance. Resistance to what is happening, resistance to how you feel, resistance to how things are unfolding. And that resistance creates friction, inner friction, a pressure inside you that feels like stress, anxiety, frustration. But what if that pressure is not coming from life itself, but from your refusal to allow it? This is what changes when you stop resisting. The situation may remain the same, but your relationship to it transforms completely. Pain may still arise, but it is no longer amplified by rejection. Uncertainty may still exist, but it is no longer intensified by fear. Change may still happen, but it is no longer experienced as a threat, because you are no longer standing against life. You are standing with it. And in that shift, there is a profound release. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, but deeply relieving. Like something inside you has been holding tension for years, and finally, lets go. But this does not mean passivity. It does not mean you stop acting, stop living, stop responding. It means your actions are no longer driven by fear and resistance. They come from clarity, from understanding, from presence. You still move through life. You still make decisions. You still engage with the world. But there is no longer a constant struggle behind it. No longer a need to force everything into place. No longer a pressure to make life match your expectations, because you have seen something clearly, that life does not need to match your mind for you to be at peace. And this realization changes everything, because now you are no longer dependent on outcomes. You are no longer waiting for the perfect moment. You are no longer trying to fix every imperfection. You are simply here with what is, as it is, without adding resistance. And this state is not something you achieve. It is something that appears when you stop interfering. This is what Gautama Buddha pointed toward in the deepest sense. Not a method to control life, but a way of seeing that removes the need to control it. Because the moment you clearly see the cost of resistance, you naturally begin to let it go. Not as a technique, not as an effort, but as an understanding. You see that fighting reality only creates more suffering. You see that holding on only creates more fear. You see that trying to control what cannot be controlled only exhausts you. And in that seeing, the grip loosens, gradually, naturally, without force. And as the grip loosens, your experience of life begins to change. You feel less pressure, less urgency, less inner conflict. Not because life has changed, but because you have stopped adding to it. You have stopped turning every moment into a problem. You have stopped turning every discomfort into a struggle. You have stopped turning every change into a threat. And in that absence of struggle, something new emerges. A quiet ease, a natural flow, a sense that life can move, without you needing to control every part of it. And this is where true freedom begins. Not freedom from life, but freedom within it. Freedom from the constant need to fix, control, and resist. Freedom from the illusion that everything must go your way. Freedom from the belief that peace depends on conditions. And once you begin to taste this, even slightly, you realize something that changes your entire perspective. You don't need to control life to be at peace. You only need to stop fighting it. And in that simple shift, everything becomes lighter, more open, more real, because for the first time, you are not standing against life. You are finally allowing it to be. And that allowance is the beginning of a completely different way of living, a way where suffering no longer defines your experience, because resistance no longer fuels it. And from here, something even deeper begins to unfold. The moment you see clearly, now something begins to change in a way that is not loud, not dramatic, not something you can point to and say, "This is it." It happens quietly, almost invisibly, because for the first time, you are not trying to escape your experience. You are not trying to fix it, improve it, replace it, or run from it. You are simply seeing it exactly as it is. And this is where clarity begins. Not the kind of clarity that comes from thinking more, but the kind that appears when thinking is no longer interfering, because for so long, your experience of life has been filtered through judgments, filtered through expectations, filtered through the constant need for things to be different. So you were never really seeing reality. You were seeing your interpretation of it. You were seeing what your mind told you it meant. And that interpretation was shaping everything. If something didn't match your expectations, it became a problem. If something felt uncomfortable, it became something to escape. If something felt good, it became something to hold on to. And through this constant filtering, you lost contact with what is actually here. You were not living life. You were reacting to it. But now, something shifts. You begin to notice the experience itself before the mind labels it. Before it says, "This is good," or "This is bad." Before it turns it into a story. You feel a sensation, and you stay with it. You notice a thought, and you don't follow it. You experience an emotion, and you allow it to rise and fall. And in this simple act of observation, something powerful happens. The experience begins to reveal its true nature. You see that thoughts are not solid. They appear and disappear. You see that emotions are not permanent. They rise and fade. You see that sensations are not fixed. They move, they shift, they dissolve. Everything is in motion. Everything is changing. Everything is flowing. And yet, for so long, you were trying to hold on to it, trying to stabilize it, trying to make it stay. And that effort was creating your suffering. But now, as you observe, without interference, you begin to understand something directly. There is nothing to hold. There is nothing to fix. There is nothing to control, because everything you experience is already moving on its own. This is not an idea. It is something you see, moment by moment, thought by thought, emotion by emotion. And as this seeing deepens, the need to interfere begins to fade. Not because you force it, but because you understand it is unnecessary. You understand that trying to control what is constantly changing is the source of your tension. So you stop adding tension. You stop resisting what is already happening. You stop turning every moment into something that needs to be different. And in that absence of interference, something extraordinary begins to appear. A sense of space. Not physical space, but inner space. A space between you and your thoughts. A space between you and your reactions. A space where you are no longer immediately pulled into every experience. And in that space, there is freedom. Not freedom from life, but freedom from being controlled by it. Freedom from being lost in every thought. Freedom from being overwhelmed by every emotion. Freedom from reacting automatically to everything that happens. Because now, you are seeing. And that seeing changes everything. You begin to notice how suffering is created in real time. You see the moment a thought appears and says, "This shouldn't be happening." You see the moment resistance begins to form. You see the moment the mind tries to hold on to something or push something away. And because you see it, you are no longer completely inside it. You are no longer fully identified with it. You are watching it. And that changes your relationship to it completely. Because what you observe, you are no longer trapped in. The pattern may still arise, but it no longer has the same power. It no longer controls you in the same way. Because awareness breaks the automatic cycle. And as this continues, moment after moment, something begins to dissolve. Not your thoughts, not your emotions, not your experiences, but your attachment to them, your identification with them, your belief that they define you. And as that attachment weakens, so does suffering. Because suffering depends on identification. It depends on you believing that every thought is true, that every emotion is permanent, that every experience must be controlled. But when you see clearly that none of these things are fixed, none of these things are stable, none of these things are truly you, something inside you relaxes, deeply, naturally, without effort. Because for the first time, you are not trying to hold on to anything. You are not trying to become anything. You are not trying to escape anything. You are simply here with what is. And in that state, there is a kind of peace that does not come from achieving anything. A peace that does not depend on conditions. A peace that does not disappear when things change. Because it is not created by the external world. It is revealed when the internal struggle ends. This is what Gautama Buddha pointed toward. Not a new belief, not a new system, but a direct way of seeing. A way of seeing that removes illusion. A way of seeing that dissolves suffering at its root. Because once you clearly see how suffering is created, you cannot unknow it. You cannot go back to blindly reacting. You cannot fully believe every thought again. You cannot completely identify with every emotion. Something has shifted. Something has opened. And even if the old patterns return, they no longer feel as solid. They no longer feel as absolute. Because you have seen through them, even if only for a moment. And that moment is enough. Because it shows you what is possible. It shows you that suffering is not fixed. It shows you that your experience is not controlled by the outside world. It shows you that there is another way of living, a way that is not based on chasing, not based on resisting, not based on controlling, but based on seeing clearly, fully, without distortion. And as that seeing deepens, something remarkable begins to happen. You begin to trust the present moment, not because it is perfect, but because you are no longer fighting it. You begin to feel at ease, not because everything is resolved, but because you are no longer creating unnecessary conflict. You begin to experience life, not as something to fix, but as something to witness. And In that witnessing, there is a quiet, unshakable, effortless peace, not something you hold, not something you protect, but something that is always here when you stop interfering. And once you begin to taste this, even slightly, you understand something that cannot be explained with words. You understand that the end of suffering is not something you achieve, it is something you uncover. The moment you see clearly and stop adding to it, the silence beneath everything. Now something begins to open that cannot be understood through thinking alone, because thinking itself has been the very movement that kept it hidden. And for the first time, you are not trying to solve your experience, not trying to escape it, not trying to replace it with something better, but simply remaining with what is already here. And in that simple yet unfamiliar act of remaining, a deeper layer of your experience begins to reveal itself. This layer has always been present, but it was constantly covered by noise, not the noise of the world, but the noise of your own mind, the endless stream of thoughts, reactions, interpretations, and silent narratives that were always commenting on everything, judging everything, trying to shape everything into something more comfortable, more predictable, more aligned with what you believed life should be. And because this movement was continuous, you never truly experienced silence, not real silence, not the kind that exists beneath all activity, but only brief pauses between thoughts, small gaps that were immediately filled, again, by the next wave of thinking, the next reaction, the next desire to become something else. But now, as you begin to observe, without interfering, without feeding every thought, without following every impulse, something different begins to happen. The movement of the mind starts to slow, not because you forced it to stop, but because you are no longer giving it the same energy, the same attention, the same unconscious belief that every thought must be followed and every reaction must be completed. And in that slowing, something becomes noticeable that was always there but never clearly seen, a background stillness, a quiet presence that does not come and go like thoughts, that does not rise and fall like emotions, that does not depend on circumstances or conditions. At first, this stillness feels unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, because it does not carry the intensity that the mind is used to. It does not provide stimulation. It does not give you something to hold on to. It simply is, and because it is so simple, the mind may overlook it or even reject it, believing that it is nothing, that it is not enough, that it cannot be what you have been searching for. But if you remain, if you do not turn away, if you allow yourself to stay with this quiet presence without trying to change it or enhance it, you begin to notice something extraordinary. This stillness is not empty, it is not lifeless, it is not lacking anything. It is deeply alive, deeply aware, and completely at ease. It does not need anything to complete it. It does not need happiness to validate it. It does not need control to sustain it. It is already whole, already stable, already complete in a way that does not depend on anything outside of it. And this is where the deepest misunderstanding begins to dissolve, because you realize that everything you have been chasing, every form of happiness, every moment of pleasure, every state you tried to hold on to, was only a temporary reflection of something much deeper, something that does not come and go, something that is not created by conditions, something that is always present but rarely noticed. This is the silence beneath everything, not a silence that removes life, but a silence that allows life to be experienced without distortion, without the constant interference of the mind trying to control it, judge it, or turn it into something else. From this silence, thoughts can still arise, but they are seen as movements, not as truth. Emotions can still appear, but they are felt fully, without becoming overwhelming. Experiences can still unfold, but they are not turned into problems that need to be solved. Life continues, but the struggle does not. because the struggle was never in life itself. It was in the mind's relationship to life, in its constant need to interfere, to control, to become. And now that this interference is no longer automatic, now that it is being seen clearly, something begins to fall away. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, naturally, like a weight that has been carried for so long that you forgot it was there. And now, as it begins to lift, you feel lighter, not because something new has been added, but because something unnecessary has been removed. And in that lightness, there is a different way of being. You are no longer moving through life with the same urgency, the same pressure to fix everything, the same need to constantly improve your experience. You are moving with awareness, with presence, with a quiet understanding that nothing needs to be forced for this moment to be complete. This does not mean you stop acting. It does not mean you become passive or indifferent. It means your actions are no longer driven by fear or lack. They arise naturally from clarity, from understanding, from a place that is not trying to escape the present moment, but fully rooted in it. And from this place, something very subtle but very powerful becomes clear. You are no longer searching for peace, because you are no longer creating the disturbance that was covering it. You are no longer chasing happiness, because you are no longer depending on temporary states to feel complete. You are simply here, not as an idea, not as a concept, not as something you are trying to maintain, but as a direct experience of being, without the constant overlay of becoming. This is what Gautama Buddha pointed toward. Not a distant goal, not a final achievement, but a direct realization that is available in this very moment when the mind stops interfering and begins to see clearly. And once this is seen, even briefly, even for a moment, something irreversible begins, because you have touched a dimension of your experience that is not dependent on conditions, that is not affected by the constant changes of life, that remains steady even as everything else moves. You may still experience challenges, you may still feel emotions, you may still encounter uncertainty, but beneath all of it, there is a stability that was not there before, not because it was created, but because it was uncovered. And this changes everything, because now, even in the midst of movement, there is stillness. Even in the presence of change, there is stability. Even in the flow of life, there is a sense of ease that does not need to be protected. And this is where the deepest form of freedom begins to emerge. Not freedom from life, but freedom within it. Freedom from the constant need to control, to fix, to chase, to resist. Freedom from the illusion that something is missing. Freedom from the endless cycle of becoming. And this freedom is not something you achieve at the end of a long journey. It is something that becomes visible the moment you stop interfering with what is already here. And as this becomes clearer, as this silence becomes more familiar, as this presence becomes more stable, you begin to realize something that cannot be explained, only experienced. That what you were searching for was never somewhere else. It was never in the future. It was never in a better version of yourself. It was always here, hidden beneath the noise, waiting not to be created, but to be seen. And now, as you begin to see it more clearly, more consistently, more deeply, the entire structure of your suffering begins to lose its foundation, because without the constant movement of the mind creating resistance, without the continuous effort to control what cannot be controlled, without the belief that something must be different for you to be at peace, there is nothing left to sustain that suffering. And in that absence, what remains is not emptiness, but completeness. Not silence as absence, but silence as presence. Not a void, but a fullness that does not depend on anything. And this is where everything changes, not on the surface, not in a way that others can easily see, but at the core of your experience, in the way you relate to everything, in the way you meet each moment, in the way you exist, because you are no longer trying to become something else. You are no longer trying to escape what is here. You are no longer lost in the illusion that something is missing. You are simply present, fully, clearly, without resistance. And in that presence, you discover something that was always there, something that was never broken, never incomplete, never in need of fixing. A silence that holds everything, a stillness that allows everything, a peace that remains no matter what comes and no matter what goes. When nothing is left to hold, everything is free. Now you arrive at the point your mind has been unknowingly avoiding your entire life, not because it is difficult, but because it dissolves the very foundation of everything the mind has been building, protecting, chasing, and becoming. And for the first time, there is nothing left to add, nothing left to fix, nothing left to improve. And yet what remains is not emptiness in the way you once feared, but something far more complete than anything you have ever tried to achieve. Because until now, your entire life has been driven by a single movement, a quiet but constant sense that something is missing, something needs to be changed, something needs to be improved, something needs to be reached before you can finally feel at ease. And this movement has shaped everything: your decisions, your thoughts, your relationships, your identity, your sense of purpose, all built around the idea that you are not yet where you need to be. And because of that belief, you have been moving forward endlessly, not just physically, but psychologically, always becoming, always adjusting, always trying to arrive at a version of yourself that finally feels complete, finally feels stable, finally feels free from the discomfort that has been following you for so long. But now, something shifts in a way that is almost invisible, yet completely transformative, because you begin to see that the feeling of something missing was never coming from reality. It was being created by the mind itself, by its constant comparison between what is and what should be, between what you are and what you believe you need to become. And when this is seen clearly, not as an idea but as a direct experience, something begins to fall away naturally, without force, without effort, without any attempt to change it. The entire movement of becoming starts to slow, and with it, the sense of lack that has been driving your life begins to dissolve, because you begin to realize that there is no point in time where everything will finally be perfect, no future moment where life will stop changing, no state where nothing will ever disturb you again. And the more deeply this is understood, the more clearly you see that the search itself was based on an illusion. The illusion that peace is something you will find later. The illusion that completeness is something you must achieve. The illusion that this moment is not enough. And when that illusion begins to fade, even slightly, something unexpected happens. The need to move away from this moment weakens. The urge to fix everything softens. The pressure to become something else disappears. And for the first time, you are no longer living in the future. You are not waiting for life to begin. You are not preparing for a better version of yourself. You are simply here, fully, completely, without the weight of becoming. And in that presence, something profound reveals itself, not as a thought, not as a belief, but as a direct knowing that nothing is missing, not because everything is perfect, but because the idea of something missing was never true to begin with. It was created by the mind, sustained by thought, reinforced by habit. And now, as that structure weakens, what remains is something that does not depend on conditions, something that does not come and go, something that does not need to be maintained or protected, a quiet completeness, a stillness that is not disturbed by change, a presence that does not need improvement. And this is where the deepest transformation happens, not because something new has been added to your life, but because everything that was unnecessary has begun to fall away. The constant tension, the endless comparison, the silent dissatisfaction, the need to control, the fear of losing, all of it begins to lose its grip. Not instantly, not completely, but undeniably. Because once you see that there is nothing to hold on to, the need to hold begins to fade. Once you see that there is nowhere to arrive, the need to search begins to dissolve. Once you see that there is no fixed self to protect, the need to defend begins to weaken. And in the absence of these movements, something becomes possible that was never possible before. Effortless being, not as an idea, not as a practice, but as a natural state that reveals itself when nothing is being forced. You are still here. You still think. You still feel. You still act. But there is no longer a center that is trying to control everything. No longer a self that is constantly measuring, comparing, becoming. No longer a seeker that is moving towards something else. There is only this moment, alive, unfolding, complete in itself. And this does not mean life becomes perfect. It does not mean challenges disappear. It does not mean emotions stop arising. It means that none of these things are turned into suffering in the same way, because the resistance that once amplified them is no longer present. Pain may still come, but it is not resisted. Loss may still happen, but it is not turned into a story of, "This should not be." Uncertainty may still exist, but it is not experienced as something that must be controlled, because you are no longer standing against life. You are no longer trying to reshape it into something it is not. You are allowing it, fully, without interference. And in that allowance, there is a freedom that cannot be described in terms of happiness or success or achievement, because it is not a state that comes and goes. It is not dependent on circumstances. It is not something you can gain or lose. It is simply the absence of the struggle that once defined your experience. And this is what Gautama Buddha pointed toward in the deepest sense. Not a destination, not a final state, but the ending of illusion, the ending of the false belief that something is missing, the ending of the constant movement of becoming. And when that movement ends, even for a moment, you see something clearly that cannot be unseen, that you were never incomplete, that you were never lacking anything essential, that the peace you were searching for was not something to be created, but something that was always present beneath the noise of your own mind. And now, as that noise quiets, as the need to become fades, as the illusion of lack dissolves, you find yourself in a place that is not a place at all, but a way of being that does not depend on time, does not depend on circumstances, does not depend on anything outside of itself. A way of being that is simple, silent, effortless, and completely free. And from here, life continues. Moments come, moments go. Experiences rise, experiences fade, but something remains unchanged. Something that is not touched by the movement. Something that does not come and go. Something that does not need to be protected or maintained. And that something is what you have been searching for all along. Not as an object, not as a goal, but as the very ground of your experience. And now, finally, you see it. Not through effort, not through struggle, but through the ending of everything that was covering it. And in that ending, there is no longer anything to seek, no longer anything to become, no longer anything to fix. Only this, clear, present, complete, exactly as it is. And in that realization, the search ends, and what remains was always here. So after everything, after all the thinking, all the searching, all the trying to understand, you arrive at something so simple that the mind almost misses it. You were never trapped by life. You were never trapped by circumstances. You were only trapped by the way your mind was meeting each moment, trying to control it, trying to change it, trying to turn it into something better. And in that constant effort, you created the very suffering you were trying to escape. But now, You see it, not as an idea, but as something real, something direct. You see how the mind creates tension, how it resists, how it holds, how it chases, and how all of that was never necessary. And in that seeing, something begins to fall away, not forced, not controlled, not achieved, just released. And what remains is not happiness in the way you imagined. It is something quieter, something deeper, a stillness that does not depend on anything, a peace that is not created by conditions, a presence that does not need to be improved, because for the first time, you are not trying to become anything. You are not trying to reach somewhere else. You are not trying to fix this moment. You are simply here, and in that, nothing is missing. Not because everything is perfect, but because you are no longer searching for something more. So maybe the truth is not about becoming happier. Maybe it is about seeing clearly, because the moment you truly see, the struggle ends. And when the struggle ends, what remains is freedom, quiet, effortless, always here, waiting for you to stop running and finally notice